Hello, Lab 3 we talk about the integumentary system. And the integumentary system is just a fancy way of saying skin. We all think of skin as a barrier between the outside and the internal world, but in addition to that, skin has many other functions. It insulates and cushions our underlying tissues. It protects the body from abrasions, exposures to chemicals and bacteria. It prevents water loss. It has a key role in temperature regulation through sweating and shivering. It excretes urea, salt, and water. It's able to activate or inactivate certain hormones and drugs. With the help of UV light, it synthesizes vitamin D. And it's also an important sense organ. We sense touch, temperature, pain, pressure, all sorts of things through our skin. The layers of the skin are the epidermis and the dermis. Below the skin proper is a layer called the hypodermis. The hypodermis is not actually part of skin. It's kind of the underlying fat layer. So the epidermis is made of special tissue called keratinized squamous epithelium. We know from the last lab that squamous means a flat scale-like cell. And here we have keratinized squamous epithelium. Keratin is a waxy substance that prevents water loss. Like all epithelial tissue, the epidermis is avascular. It doesn't have any blood vessels. It depends on the blood vessels in the dermis to deliver the nutrients to the dermis, and then those nutrients or gases or what have you are going to diffuse into the epidermis or diffuse out of the epidermis depending on what you're talking about. The epidermis is made of 4 layers throughout most of the body, and it's made of 5 layers in the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. So those locations, we call that skin thick skin. And so the order of the layers can be remembered by this fun little mnemonic. It's come, let's get sunburned. Okay, so the outermost layer, the layer that we can see, is the stratum corneum. It's 20 to 30 layers of dead, flattened cells. In the thick skin of our palms and the soles of our feet, the next layer is the stratum lucidum. This layer looks very light under a microscope, and lucidum means light. Again, it's only found in the thick skin, and it's composed of dead cells. Okay, we're back to layers that are found everywhere. The next layer down is the stratum granulosum. The stratum granulosum is a much thinner layer than we've been talking about. It's 4 to 6 layers, and we're still dead. Going down, we have the stratum spinosum, and we finally have a living layer. The stratum spinosum is several layers thick. The reason why it's called the stratum spinosum, it's named spinosum for spiny, and under certain conditions, when you look at it under a microscope, it looks as if the cells have kind of pointy projections, like they're spiny. And last but not least is the stratum basale. It's the lowest layer of the epidermis, and it's where mitosis occurs. So that's where all the cell division occurs. And so here's a nice slide of these layers. So here we see all these little purple dots, and these little purple dots are nuclei. And so we know we're looking at that mitotically active stratum basale. Above the stratum basale in this region, this is the stratum spinosum, where we find those spiny cells. You can't really see that they're spiny cells here. I just think of this stratum spinosum as the area above the thin stratum basale and below this dark layer, which is the stratum granulosum. This image is of thick skin, so above the stratum granulosum we have this light layer of the stratum lucidum, and then we have this very thick layer of the stratum corneum. The dermis is much easier to remember. There's only two layers. In the dermis, we have the papillary layer, and this is the upper layer. The papillary layer of the dermis has these little finger-like projections, and so papillae are little projections. And so whatever you see that that term, you know you're going to be looking at things that look like, you know, fingers coming out. You'll see it a few times in anatomy and physiology. Below the papillary layer is the reticular layer. This is where we have our blood vessels, our sweat and sebaceous glands, our pressure receptors. So the papillary layer is made of areolar connective tissue, and the reticular layer is made of dense, irregular, fibrous connective tissue. So the areolar connective tissue is that very loose connective tissue, and the dense, irregular connective tissue is that connective tissue that looks like ground beef. And below that is the hypodermis that we've talked about. It's a layer of adipose tissue. It's also called the subcutaneous layer or the superficial fascia. We're going to go through some of the structures of skin, and we're going to start with hair. And we have hair almost all over our body. The only place we don't have hair is those areas that have thick skin, right? We don't have hair on the palms of our hands or the soles of our feet. When we look at hair, we're going to start by looking at the follicle down here. And the follicle is where the root of the hair is anchored. And from the root, the hair shaft is going to grow out. Attached to the follicle, we have sebaceous glands. And sebaceous glands is just the scientific way of saying oil gland. And oil glands are going to secrete oil, and it's going to kind of go along the hair shaft, and that's why our hair gets greasy if we don't shampoo very regularly. We also have this little tiny muscle, and this muscle is anchored to the epidermis and to the hair follicle. And when this muscle contracts, we get goosebumps. When we see this muscle contracting in animals, it's like when cats get scared and their hair puffs out. It's those little erector pili muscles that makes the hair stand on end. In addition to the sebaceous glands, we also have sweat glands. And there's two different types of sweat glands. There's the eccrine sweat glands and the apocrine sweat glands. The eccrine sweat glands we have all over our body, and so this is a little illustration of an eccrine sweat gland. And the eccrine sweat glands are really important in cooling the body off, right? So we sweat all over when we're exercising, and it evaporates and we cool off. The apocrine glands are only found in the axillary, so that's the armpit, and the anogenital, so the regions where the anus and the genitals are. And so they become active at puberty. And there's a difference in the way that eccrine sweat glands release sweat through the pores and apocrine sweat glands. With apocrine sweat glands, there's a bit of cellular material that goes with the sweat, and that's that cellular material that bacteria can survive off of. And so that is the reason why we tend to, the sweat in the armpit region can be a little stinky because there can be bacterial growth there. Okay. In addition to the glands, we have sensory receptors. And so I want you to take your hand, and you're going to, so take your right hand, and I want you to just brush your fingertips on the top of your left forearm, just very lightly, and you can feel that's a really light touch, and you can kind of, if you're really thinking about it, you can sense that that's at the top part of your skin. And so that touch is sensed by things called tactile corpuscles. They're also called Meissner's corpuscles. And these are found in those little finger-like projections, the dermal papillae. So that's why I make you take your fingertips and do that light touch. That's so you remember that they're found in those finger-like projections of the dermal papillae. Now I want you to take your thumb and push into your forearm, and so that's a type of deep pressure. And when you're doing that, it's being sensed by lamellar corpuscles. They're also called Pacinian corpuscles. These are corpuscles that are at the dermal hypodermal junction, and they actually look very similar to thumbprints. We'll see a slide of them a little bit later. Speaking of slides, we're just going to go through some of the structures here. So here is a hair follicle with its hair shaft and the sebaceous gland. We have the layers of the epidermis again. Here we can see the sebaceous gland a little bit better, and we also can see an eccrine sweat gland. And here's that slide with those Meissner's corpuscles and the dermal papillae and the Pacinian corpuscles. So those tactile corpuscles or Meissner's corpuscles are found up here. And the Pacinian corpuscles, look, it looks just like a thumbprint, are found at the dermis and hypodermis junction. In your lab practice slideshow, you have pictures of this skin model, and I just want to go through this skin model because this skin model is great. It has a region of thick skin where you can see that stratum lucidum. You can also see the Meissner's corpuscles and the Pacinian corpuscle. It has a region of armpit skin or axillary skin. And so we see the eccrine sweat glands, but we also see the apocrine sweat glands. And then we have the scalp skin over here, and you can see those structures that are associated with the hair follicle. Okay, in the close-up picture that I gave you, you can actually identify all the layers of the skin. So here's that stratum corneum and the light stratum lucidum and the dark stratum granulosum. Below that we have the stratum spinosum, and finally that last of the purple layers is the stratum basale. Stay tuned for part 2 where we talk about body membranes.